So thank you everyone for joining us. We'll just start getting started here then with some introductions. My name is Jo Clubb. I'm a sports science consultant. I work under my company of Global Performance Insights that strives to make sports science digestible, working with sports teams, sports tech companies, and practitioners all around the world. And I am honoured today to be the host and to chair this panel of practitioners. So I will pass over to Dawn. Dawn, if you, I'm sure many people don't need an introduction from you, but if you could introduce yourself and then pass over the baton.
Thank you, thank you, Jo. Thank you, and hello everybody on the call. My name's Dawn Scott. I am sports science trained. Then for 25 years, I know I don't look that old. I have worked in elite women's football across national teams and clubs, and then I also did my PhD. Building out a trainer model for elite female players. I'm currently consultant and excited to be part of this webinar today. I
Thank you,
will
Dawn.
pass to Georgia.
Hi everyone, my name's Georgia Brown. I'm a sports scientist currently with San Diego Wave women's soccer team here in the USA. I previously worked with the Australian women's national teams from the youth teams up to the Matildas as well. Whilst I was with the national teams, I also completed my PhD looking at how the menstrual cycle affects football or soccer performance and recovery.
Okay, that leaves me. I'm Nicole Surdyka. I am a physical therapist and sports scientist. I worked in the NWSL as well as consulting in the MLS. And now I have my company, Femme Football Collective, which aims to provide community and a platform for continued learning and growth for practitioners working in women's football.
Amazing. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. Brilliant panel and really nice mixture, I think. Club experience, international experience, different countries. We've also got different backgrounds in terms of sports science, in terms of PT. So hopefully something for everyone today. Just to confirm that those who are still joining or join late, that you will automatically receive the recording of this webinar. So hopefully there'll be lots of value and you can come back to it. So the title of our webinar today, then, the importance of load monitoring in women's soccer. I just then want to start with our big picture approach to load monitoring. Now, of course, there's plenty of rabbit holes we could dive into, and budgets, resources, and everything will determine what that really looks like. But from an ideal perspective, what's your kind of philosophy? What does that big picture look like to you? So, Georgia, maybe do you want to get us started with that question?
Yeah, sure. When we're looking at load monitoring, really important to grab both the external load and the internal load. And typically when we're looking at external load, that means GPS. And most people working in football or sport will be familiar with GPS. We're looking at the amount of work done. So things like total distance, high-speed running, sprinting, accelerations, decelerations, and percentages of max velocity. And then when we're looking at internal load, depending on your budget, ideally we have heart rate available. And then for those teams that have lower budgets, looking at something like an RPE scale or rating of perceived exertion to get an idea of how the person is responding to the prescribed workload. We look at these different load monitoring variables in a number of ways, but hopefully we're looking at that to help reduce injury risk, to improve fitness, ensure our players can meet the game demands or exceed the game demands even better, monitor their fatigue and monitor their freshness as well. So through the combination of these two metrics or variables, looking at internal and external load, hopefully we can achieve these different factors.
Great, thank you, Georgia. Nicole, Dawn, anything you would add to that?
No, I just think I think the only thing is, obviously, as technology has evolved, I think that's where almost your use of technology or data kind of changes with it. Like when I started 25 years ago, GPS wasn't the thing, and so I used heart rates. And even back then, when I worked with the England women's national team, the players were not professional, so they were amateur, and they would have heart rate watchers and almost say that that's their personal trainer. I think one thing that is really important for heart rate monitoring is to assess the individual player's heart rate max and not just use predictability or prediction kind of formula for that. And then obviously program, again, whatever your philosophy or thinking is around percentages. Is it 85%? Is it 90% of heart rate max, depending on what you want to get out of the player, I think is important. I do think I was guilty of it as well, and many of us were, that when GPS technology came out, it was almost the internal load of heart rate almost kind of went out, and it was like, oh, look at this shiny new toy. But for me, I think when you don't have that internal load, you're just missing how the player responds to that kind of individual dose. So I just think that is really important. And then I'm sure we'll get onto it, but just the female lens and the female player, both from a what technology or support has that female player had as a girl, as a young player in sport, through to some of the menstrual cycle, female physiology considerations as well. But ultimately, everything comes down to the individual lens, whether you're a male or a female athlete or player.
Yeah, I would just echo the internal and external load bits and making sure we're tracking those. And then the layer then beyond that would be both objective and subjective. And as Georgia touched on with the subjective as well in terms of an RPE. And then for me, there's still nothing that outperforms or outdoes just kind of talking to a player and seeing how they come in the door in the morning. And if they're looking down or exhausted and you can see it in their eyes, like that's automatically a conversation starter. Okay, did we not recover as well from whatever external load was applied the day before? Something like the subjective wellness check-ins, are they reporting soreness that's expected or unexpected based on the loads that were applied in previous sessions? So I would just echo what was said and then just layer on both objective and subjective. And for me, the subjective is always going to be a high priority item for me.
Yeah, I think all of those points then highlight that there's not one single dimension to load. There's not one single technology or even one single metric. And obviously, we are supported today by Firstbeat Sports, who obviously we thank for putting on this webinar. And we are going to spend a bit of time talking about internal load and heart rate applications. But it was clear as from us as a group when we were preparing for this that we all genuinely believe in heart rate, and as Dawn mentioned, we have the industry, I think, has been guilty of losing sight of it for a little bit of time and been distracted by the magpie of the tracking technology. But although that, of course, has a place, it isn't telling us internally what's going on. And this is something for me I've described as like the training adaptability prediction problem. Just because we know how far and how fast our athletes have run, it doesn't guarantee how they're going to respond. And actually how we get that insight is in part, like Nicole mentioned, all the the wellness and the response measures, but also that internal load that's describing the cost to an athlete during the session. So I wonder if we could dive a little bit deeper then on that, and maybe if each of you could kind of share like a real example or application of using heart rate, potentially with the external load as well, or just standalone in the training environment, in the game environment, in your settings. And again, not to pick on you, Georgia, but I know your club has taken on Firstbeat recently, so maybe if I start with you, because hopefully it's very fresh and day-to-day responsibility for you at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. We started using Firstbeat this year, and the ability to have the live, accurate heart rate data alongside our GPS data on the same iPad we use it has been really beneficial. For example, when we've had new players coming in this year where we're not really familiar with their training history or their fitness or what type of profile that athlete is. For example, we have players in soccer that are more fast twitch versus slow twitch, and we can get a bit of an idea of their heart rate response. And we've been working with them for a little while, but we had some new players come in this year, and though we did some physical testing with them, we could see that, for example, during small-sided games, medium-sized games, how they were responding to that load internally, though they all had the same external load that we were giving them that session, was very different. And so then we were able to adapt the training session, whether that be the number of games they played, the rest periods they had, whether they did runs in between or not, and how we then planned for them in the following weeks was really beneficial to make sure we weren't just killing those girls who were new and coming in. But if they were adapting and they were being able to take on that load, we could continue to push them appropriately.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks. That's really nice, pertinent example from you, given where you're at in the season as well. So, yeah. Any other thoughts here, Dawn? What was your take?
I think there's a couple of things. I think education is also key, both of the play themselves and the coaches, the technical coaches. For me, there's a couple of things. I think one is, a GPS where now for females, there's, a sports bra and a pouch that you can put on the sports bra. So for the player, they're not putting anything else on that they wouldn't usually wear. For me, oftentimes I've had players feel that the heart rate strap is irritating them, and that's the first thing to go. So I think there's the education piece of why keeping a heart rate strap on is important. I think there's, again, I'm not sure Firstbeat, I've used Firstbeat very briefly, maybe it's about 10 years ago, but not most recently. So I don't know what their fit is for that. I know there's also GPS bras that have the heart rate connection in there. For me, I've not really found those to be accurate, so I think that's a consideration. But I think the other piece on the education, it's funny because my example is probably the other way, where, again, being a dinosaur, pre-GPS, we had heart rate alone. And when we were looking at heart rate zones, there was a player with the US women's team where her heart rate response was continually lower than other players for small-sided games or training or whatever. And so the coach at the time, Pia Sundhag, and she'd probably laugh about this, so I think it's okay that I say her name, she'd make us run this player do more and more. Now suddenly we add in the external load, and actually this player is just kind of fit and efficient, and was somebody who maybe struggled to get up above 90% of her heart rate max. So it almost worked the other way of educating the coach and educating the player on the importance of internal and external. And once we did get both, it was like, oh shit, no, we shouldn't have her do an extra. She's just, kind of efficient and potentially, cardio recovering quicker and fitter than some of the other players. So I think it also works both ways. And I think that's just where that education piece of, first and foremost, why they should keep this strap on, also getting a good connection, because again, there's some providers out there where you get the straps and you get the male size straps and they're not going to fit the female players. So making sure you get a good strap with a good connection, I think is important as well.
Yeah, I would have a little bit more of like the rehab lens, of course, given my background, and the ways that I've used it is when we start reintegrating a player back into pitch-based sessions with the team. And especially during a long-term rehab, even it doesn't need to be, months and months, just a couple of weeks even. And there is a deterioration in some physical qualities and capacities. And so making sure that as they're being reintroduced, kind of along the same lines of what Georgia was saying, that with a new player, it's similar to a rehabbing athlete or a return to play player who is now being reintegrated, and maybe we notice in the live sessions that their heart rate is elevated compared in like a small-sided game compared to the rest of the team, but then also what this player was at for a similar small-sided game prior to their injury, and having that data available is helpful. And just making sure that we're not overloading a player who is also trying to get back from an injury. And even though the injured tissue might be adapting well, maybe on a more systemic level, cardiovascularly, maybe they need a bit more time. So it's been helpful in that regard through my lens.
Yeah, I think rehab is a really clear use case as well for it. Of course, for it to be valuable in rehab, then you need to understand as well the baseline of where the player was at pre-injury. And I know, again, rehab, something we spoke about in preparation for this call. And I think, Dawn, it was yourself that mentioned you think heart rate is underrated, in fact, in rehab. I wondered if you could share your thoughts as well on the back of what Nicole's just shared there.
Yeah, I feel in some environments that if it is a long-term rehab, in part I understand it, that sometimes maybe as a player is told they don't have to, I don't know, keep wearing the GPS or keep wearing the heart rate or fill in the wellness every day. And I get like a long road injury is an intense injury and there's different stages of, mood state and support for the player. However, if you want to keep their baseline cardio, kind of at a good level, sometimes they might be doing a cardio session that isn't outside. So now they're on a bike or an elliptical or whatever. So they're not wearing, again, if it's a system, not Firstbeat, that is linked up to the GPS, they might say, well, I don't have the GPS, so I don't have heart rate because, again, some of those units are only able to connect to that and maybe it's not Bluetooth. So again, I think it's exploring how else you can get that heart rate or internal load, even if the player is inside on some kind of cardio machine inside, because I think you can't then just expect that the player is going to pop up and be ready to go again on the field. And also for me, you can make sure that time inside is really efficient and you hit certain heart rate zones, areas to make sure the player is kind of keeping over and recovered and ready to then transition onto the field and be in a good stage then to progress pretty quickly. So again, I think it just comes back to that education piece of the whole MDT staff, so that again in that shared return to play process, that medical and performance are aware of the benefits, the importance, and also give the same message to the player as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Oh, sorry,
Oh, sorry,
Nicole.
go ahead. I was gonna say I couldn't agree more with that, Dawn, in that I think that the tracking kind of the heart rate data and tracking like what the athlete is doing and their response to it is often underrated and underperformed, not done or done well in a rehab setting. I think so much of that comes down to we kind of take an athlete out of the normal rhythm of being in the team. And my philosophy that I try, obviously every situation is different, but trying to keep the athlete in the same rhythm of the team. And so, like I said before, if let's say someone has a grade 2 hamstring strain, they're going to be out for a couple of weeks' time. VO2 max will deteriorate in that time. Within 10 to 14 days it starts to reduce. And so that's an important, we can't neglect the other physical capacities required for the sport just because I'm rehabbing a hamstring. We can't look at an athlete as just this tissue is injured and I need to be tissue specific to get it back to where it was. We need to look at the entire athlete. What will their needs be when they are done with this rehab? They still need to be able to meet and like Georgia said before, even exceed the demands of the sport and what will be asked of them. So I think that we do disservice to ourselves and to the athletes by neglecting the other physical capacities. And this is where I think, reconditioning is something like we can start integrating that a lot earlier in most rehabs. It doesn't have to be, okay, now you can run, so now let's go do fitness. Are there ways to offload whatever tissue is injured and needing modifications, but still addressing the other physical capacities that are needed? And if we're doing that, we need to monitor and track something to make sure that it's actually doing the job we're wanting it to do. You wouldn't just have someone do a 6-week strength training block and not track strength to make sure it worked. So same thing in a rehab, you have to have things that you're tracking and make sure that what you're doing is actually achieving the job you set out to do. And heart rate data there, I think, is invaluable really, because you're not only seeing, okay, from a cardiovascular perspective, how far off are they from being able to play in a 90-minute match? But also, how are they, like we're talking about, how are they responding to what I'm asking them to do in rehab sessions? Are they at and so many things can affect this, can affect how an individual player adapts to the external stimulus placed on them. And so in a rehab, there's so much going on psychologically. There's so much stress happening oftentimes that might affect how they're responding to an external load or a stimulus. And so if we don't have a way of taking that into consideration, we're missing a big piece of the whole picture here. So yeah, I would just echo what Don said in that looking at heart rate data is extremely valuable in a rehab setting and often vastly underappreciated.
Can I add one other quick thing there? Because I totally agree with it, and probably this is my passion piece. Obviously, Joanne Parsons and Steph Cohen did some work around the gendered societal considerations, especially for female players, and obviously their example was specific to ACL injuries. But I think it's something that we should recognise and appreciate with our female athletes, that regularly at the younger ages, girls don't get the same environments or level of support, whether it's medical, technology, education, that boys are afforded, where, a boy at a similar age might be in an academy or whatever. So again, I just think it's, if it is a girl who doesn't have that support around her, again, how can we, I don't know, widen or support or educate the systems around those athletes as well, so that they can get the specialised support or the education to optimize their rehab. I think that is just a really important consideration as well.
Yeah, I
Oh
can
my
touch on
gosh, there's so much. Sorry, I was just going to say there's so much I want to dive into and so many different jumping off points. But it is crazy to think that we monitor them so much on the pitch, and then when we bring them inside into a rehab setting, that just disappears when it doesn't necessarily need to. But Georgia, I do want to come to you because I'm interested to know, day to day at the moment. Then, are you using heart rate in the rehab setting in your situation?
Yeah, absolutely. So just as we've been monitoring their heart rate response and GPS live on the pitch with an iPad, we now have an iPad in the gym with our rehab players as well. So whether that's them doing a bike session that we've prescribed, whether they are on the O to G, whether we've got them doing an upper body session because they just can't do anything lower body at the moment, we've got them wearing the heart rate strap as well. So we're able to see how they are responding to the prescribed load that we're providing them, but also as a bit of motivation and biofeedback to them. So if we have girls on the bike and we've sent them a session, we've said, we want you to hit 5 minutes above 90% during this bike session, they can see that data live. It also helps to keep them accountable as well. So if our physical therapist has multiple players that they're working with in the gym and they can't be right on them at that moment, or the strength and conditioning coach has to be out on pitch and not in the gym, we have that monitoring piece that's provided them motivation, kept them accountable, and also kept us accountable to make sure we're providing the correct sessions for them. So I'm loving having that live feedback available, because otherwise, as you said, you don't know if what you're prescribing is providing the outcome that you want, or whether that athlete has done this. And they might have said, yeah, I did the session and I worked really hard, but we don't actually know what the result has been on that internal load cost.
I think another application that links as well with rehab and what we've been discussing as the player progresses back, um, but is the submaximal fitness test. So we've all made use of them, and I'm keen for you guys to share, how you apply it. We've been talking since the beginning about how this combination of internal and external load together is really valuable, because external load is the work done, and internal load then is the internal cost to do that physical load. So the thought with a submaximal fitness test being, if we fix that external load and standardize it, can we track the internal load, the heart rate response to that fixed external load, and use that as a way of potentially tracking fitness and fatigue status with a very minimal burden on our athletes. So yeah, as I said, I think everyone has used it here. So who wants to jump in and kind of share their approach and their experiences with the Submax fitness test?
I'll quickly just share like from a larger perspective, because then I think Don and Georgia will probably go into a little bit more like practical details into what they've done. But from the rehab setting, obviously big picture things here, you have to make sure that you're not overloading the joint or tissue that's been injured. So there is a bit of it's not necessarily, okay, I have to do the first 4 minutes of the beat test, which is, maybe what the team does with the healthy athletes. And there's a lot of reasons I like that as an example. So again, big picture would be, you want to make sure that the external load is fixed, like you mentioned. You want it to be, about 3 to 4 minutes in length. I try to make it so that it's not something where they're cutting and turning a lot, especially on a rehab side, because that tends to then just exacerbate or irritate the injured structure. And then you want to make sure that you measure the heart rate during what we used to do is the last minute of that, like whatever the average heart rate was of the last minute. And then we used to have them, as soon as the 4 minutes are up, sit down right away. That way, and you have to be consistent with this. So whether it's you have them stand still or lie down or sit, it doesn't, just make sure you're consistent. We just have them sit right away, and then after a minute, see what their heart rate had recovered to. And so those are big picture things. Also, in terms of making sure that the external load is fixed, is the effort. So it's not enough just saying, okay, jog for 4 minutes. It's making sure that it's at a fixed speed or intensity. And so there's pros and cons to any way that you would choose to do that. I like the first 4 minutes of the beat test because it's a fixed speed each time. But then with rehabbing athletes, I have to consider there's quite a lot of turns involved in that. And so if it's something like again, the hamstring strain isn't necessarily going to be that affected by that. So maybe that's still fine to use. But if it's really early on and they're still not necessarily jogging at that pace, then making sure, okay, if we're doing a bike workout, that I keep the watts at the same level or the rotations per minute, but making sure that you keep that the same. I think that's a really big consideration that often gets overlooked in the rehab setting specifically is, well, I'm just having them do 4 minutes easy on the bike. Okay, but make sure that the output is the same, So there are a number of ways to do that on the field. So I think just making sure you kind of tick those boxes of it's a continuous effort. Try not to make it so many turns, and then just making sure that it's a fixed external load so that you can truly track the internal response.
Yeah, I think similar. I first tried to introduce a submax test 10 years ago when I worked with the US women. And I did it across 3 camps, and it was 3 different locations, and one of them was Colorado. And so then I was like, is it even possible with a national team when you're traveling, you're at different environments, temperature, etc., different surfaces, even like each time it was grass, but it was different. So if I'm honest, I kind of gave up then. Then when myself, Julian Haig, we did some monitoring across the NWSL, as part of the warm-up, we would do the first 15 levels, which I think is 7 minutes of the yo-yo intermittent recovery test. But exactly to your point, Nicole, like it's obviously intermittent. So then 3 years ago at Washington Spirit, kind of consulted with, was very lucky because Rick Lovell was my PhD supervisor. So I consulted with Rick, Sean McLaren and Tazeel Shuhan. And so then it should be a continuous protocol, 4 minutes. I think the speed I want to say was 12 kilometers per hour. Now we were going to do it like laps rather than this. However, we ran into issues with a goalkeeper coach who wouldn't basically give up the space even just for 4 minutes. We did it across a whole season, and basically any time we travel, we would measure the width of we ended up doing it 4 minutes continuous across the width of the pitch. Every time we travel, we'd measure it, and then basically we'd know how long we should be across the pitch. We would have 3 members of staff across the line of players to try and help with that in terms of the pacing of it. And then we take, again, like in consultation with Rick Tazeel, the average of the last 30 seconds of the run. The data was fascinating because, I mean, we've probably seen what we might expect, where the players who were like regular starters, you've seen kind of almost like a decrease in their heart rate response, and that was almost maintained in season. Players who were getting minimum minutes, you almost seen this decrease in terms of pre-season. So then now heart rate response is better for the same load, but then it started to creep up in season because, again, we'd always have a training dose post-match or whatever, but we wouldn't always necessarily get the volume, although I would say Adam Forrest, who as our head of performance, did a great job in trying to vary kind of the dose for the player. However, you still were just not getting the volume. And then our third category of player was non-rostered players, where they're not even contention for the game. So you're still doing the same load and taper as the others. And we give a bit more of a load on a match day because they come in. And so the decrease wasn't as much, and it wasn't the same pattern for everybody. And, you know, after year one, the next idea or the next thinking was to layer a menstrual cycle phase and see where that was. However, I would say, and Georgia, you're probably finding this already, like it is a challenge in the US when you're crossing time zones, different environments. Obviously this year there's Denver, there's Orlando, the outliers, there's time zones backwards and forwards, there's different, even the different pitch surface. Like when we introduced it in the NWSL, we at least had it on turf all the time. So in some ways you control that, or you could still argue turf's different, as in like the AstroTurf. But obviously with a team, you're just playing on different surfaces. And so I think, again, you can have a picture that also be some players who might miss the session or medical might pull them out. I would always be, if they can't do this 4-minute continuous protocol, they should not be in training. But I also know Tazil Rick have now done some data work where they've actually calibrated like technical passing drills and actually seen similar responses. So I'd love to try and, integrate and play around with some of those. But I just think it's so valuable. And I think the education you can give the players, the coaches, in the end, we got stopped from doing it because one player complained about running continuous for 4 minutes. And I was like, for me, it's just frustrating because, again, it comes back to that education piece to get them on board and just the power of that data.
Yeah, so we do a Submax fitness test on our second day of training. Our head of performance, Ben Young, did quite a bit of research into the different protocols and reasons why to do it on different days. And we landed with a 4-minute test. I line up poles 45 meters apart, left around 15 seconds between each pole, which ends up being about 11 kilometers per hour. We're lucky that we have 2 pitches, so I make sure we're not on the goalkeeper pitch each time so we have the space to do it. But sometimes you're out there and half the session's been set up and you're like, oh my gosh, how am I going to fit in this and move pieces of equipment? But our equipment team's great and they'll just move things when need be. But because we do it on the second day of training, we're always at our home field. But that could have meant we've been traveling. It might be, instead of a +3, it might be a +4. So those things need to be taken into consideration. But as Dawn has said, in the preseason so far, we have seen that improvement in heart rate response, which has been really cool. And I'm interested to see how we go throughout the season. And from a practicals perspective, using Firstbeat, they have an automatic calculation in there where they take the highest 30 seconds of the heart rate response. They've now just developed a live app portion for it as well. Previously you had to download it and then go into the cloud software, but it's live there straight away as well, which is really cool. And we've used this both as the fitness monitoring perspective, and we spoke to the players about why we're doing this, and they've been brought in. If they don't have to do the 1 kilometer time trial as frequently, they're quite happy to do the 4-minute run. But also from a fatigue monitoring perspective. So not just as our only piece of information for fatigue monitoring, but we had a player giving us that subjective piece that Nicole spoke about, saying that she was just really tired. We did have a really big preseason. We paired that with looking at her wellness data, which was reporting soreness and fatigue. We married that up with the RPE data, where she was rating higher for training sessions than she usually would. Her counter movement jump was down, and we saw an increase in her submax fitness test for her heart rate as well. So marrying up all those pieces of data, the subjective, the objective, the internal and the external. And then we had a conversation with her, and we were able to make some positive changes in terms of her training load for the next 2 weeks. And we got her back to where we wanted her to be, and which she was able to, instead of overreach, we got her back to improving and adapting to the load that we'd imposed. So both the fitness perspective and then the fatigue perspective can be beneficial for the Submax fitness test.
Thanks all. I think some really, really nice practical examples, real life examples there of implementing it. I have done a video on my YouTube channel with Firstbeat talking about, firstly, the research behind the Submax fitness test and Rick and Zill's amazing work on that, and also demonstrated what Georgia described in the Firstbeat feature with the Submax fitness test, because it's really helpful. You don't have to sit and go through every player's heart rate trace. You tell it when the test started and ended, and bang, there it is for everyone.
That's
so
nice.
definitely worth looking at. Yes. Okay. We've had a few questions already. I want to come to the Q&A, but of course there's one topic that we'll touch on and try and be succinct here and leave some time still for the Q&A. But of course, Here we are in a women's soccer webinar. Of course, it's great that we've seen such increased attention in recent times in female athlete health and performance. And there seems to always be this expectation around that means you talk about the menstrual cycle. So we are in a few minutes of time going to discuss actually what, if anything, we know about how the menstrual cycle influences internal load, influences heart rate data, and how we might apply this information. So I will start with Georgia because, as Dawn mentioned earlier, she's done quite a bit of work as well in this. So yeah, big, deep question for you there, Georgia, but love to hear your take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we're looking at the menstrual cycle and changes across the cycle, generally we're talking about changes in performance, recovery, physiological responses in relation to hormonal changes. So we're assuming now that our athlete has a normal menstrual cycle and there's fluctuations in estrogen and progesterone. There is some research to show an increased resting heart rate in the luteal phase, and we see an increase in progesterone, and that's because the increase in progesterone has an increase in our thermoregulatory set point. So that means core body temperature increases, and in alignment with that, we have an increase in sympathetic drive and heart rate. However, during exercise, the research that exists is not strong to suggest at the moment that there is a change in heart rate. And I know one study off the top of my head by Sombon Wong. They worked with elite female soccer players. They looked at menstrual phase. They measured by core body temperature, basal body temperature, sorry, not hormones. They didn't actually measure hormones. They did see it rest. That increase in heart rate during the luteal phase compared to the early follicular phase. But after a warm up, they didn't see any changes in heart rate or differences between the two phases. So at rest, there might be some differences across the cycle, but during exercise, the research is really mixed currently. Also, to be able to do this implementation in a practical side with your athletes and with your team, measuring the menstrual cycle accurately, it's quite tricky to do. You can measure their cycle length by days onset of menstruation and then duration of menstruation, and then you can look at non-menstruating days. But to look at their phases is actually quite tricky. You need different hormonal measurements, and that generally means either bloods or asking a player to pee on a stick. And doing that long term, you're probably going to get some pushback from players.
Yeah, I would say this is where being in a rehab setting where it is a little bit more individualized, it can be helpful and something I've started doing a little bit more recently because everything, Georgia said, that it's hard to get a team of athletes to all accurately track menstrual cycle in a way that's actually meaningful. You need, yes, it's a good starting point to do days of cycle, days of bleeding to bleeding. That's assuming that everyone on the team is bleeding regularly. That's assuming that people on the team aren't on oral contraceptive, which many athletes are, or some other form of hormonal birth control. And so that's why I kind of like on the rehab side, looking at the individual because individual responses are so varied across the menstrual cycle. And I think it was Dawn who said this earlier, or maybe Jo, that we still need to look at the individual and whether it's men or women or whatever else, the individual is what matters here. And everyone's going to respond somewhat differently. What I do or what I've started doing more recently at the rehab level is asking athletes to track. I'll look at, okay, what day did you, this is assuming again that they're not on hormonal contraceptives. Okay, what day did you start bleeding? And I tracked that. And then how many days they bled for. And really, I'm using this as a health marker, as like another tool for monitoring their health and well-being. And okay, how many days did they bleed? And then on day 7, so if day 1 is the day they start bleeding, day 7, get them to, and a lot of this Georgia actually is informed from your work, get them to start peeing on an ovulation test strip. You can go buy it from Clear Blue. It can last an individual player a fairly long time, a couple of months. They pee on it on day 7. It tells you if they're ovulating. And the reason for this, and why I say I use this as a health marker, is that if there is something like low energy availability, or if there is something like affecting an athlete's ability to recover, one of the first hormones affected will be luteinizing hormone. And so if there's not then that surge in luteinizing hormone that brings on ovulation, you don't know that just by tracking days of the cycle. So that might be a starting point for a team-wide implementation, but on the rehab level where it is working one-on-one with a player more usually than with the whole team, you can implement this. It is reasonable to do. And so they pee on the ovulation test strip, day 7. They pee on it every morning until they get the like, yes, you've ovulated, yes, you're ovulating. And then they don't have to do it again the rest of that month. And now you know, okay, they did at least have that surge in luteinizing hormone. They are ovulating. And then you know, have to be able to do that for a couple months in a row in order to get a good baseline and compare. But it is nice to be able to do that on an individual level and just make sure, like I said, I use it as another health marker. Is there something going on that's affecting the menstrual cycle? So rather than it being menstrual cycle affecting the player, I see it more as how is like the training load and the player's response being affected, and how is the menstrual cycle showing me that? And using it in that way as another monitoring tool, essentially. So yes, like there is data about resting heart rate being a little bit more elevated in the luteal phase, and the female endurance athlete project did a good study on this with elite runners. But again, even that, there is some high variability, and also it was statistically significant of like less than 2 beats per minute. Realistic, like, is that really going to be something that we look to change or that alerts us to something? So I would just say, if you practice in practical terms, if you see a little increase in resting heart rate in the luteal phase, maybe don't like over pathologize that, and maybe consider that it's a normal trend in menstrual cycle, but really just knowing that individual's baseline and what they normally look like is really helpful.
Yeah, I think the only thing to briefly add, because I'm just aware of time in the Q&A, but for me, again, probably beating the drum of like education is so key and important, both for the player, the athlete, the practitioner. I think now that we have many practitioners coming from men's sport and or male practitioners, I think that education is key, and that should be everybody involved in and around the player, from the technical kind of sport side, business side to everybody else. And then I think the monitoring of the individual athlete is to get a picture of them individually, like what is their typical cycle length. Like a typical cycle length in the female or in the physiology textbooks is defined as 28 days, but I think 20% of females have a 28-day cycle. So I think even that, and what are their symptoms, like what individually do they symptoms typically have, how severe are those symptoms, how can you support the individual player athlete around that. And then I think just tracking and monitoring, and at times it's a conversation starter. I think the other piece is obviously heart rate, but other wearables tracking sleep temperature, you know, etc., integrated maybe with Firstbeat, I think could also be useful of, you know, again, getting a full picture of the player, the athlete, and ultimately supporting them individually. And obviously as well, earlier this year, UEFA released the consensus statement on menstrual cycle, mental health tracking, and, you know, that was twofold, one for research, but then the other for practically in environments, and they typically spoke about, you know, paper and pencil method, 3 cycles to get a picture for an individual athlete. And again, I think the important thing is like who monitors, oversees that, and then who supports or had a conversation with the player on the back of anything that maybe is flagged.
Yeah, thank you all. Obviously that's in itself a really complicated topic, but I think you did a really nice job there of summarizing the realities of it, the practicalities of it. Dawn, earlier as well, you mentioned Joanne Parsons' work around the sociology here. So whenever we're looking at women's performance or injury historically, we have looked purely at biology, and now there's some great work there highlighting, as you mentioned, the differences in the sociology, the resources around girls and female athletes that we must not forget. So before I think we get too distracted about how like the menstrual cycle and female health might influence this data, well, are we even giving our female athletes the opportunity to collect this data? I'll share at the end as well that Firstbeat have they've given a bonus available for webinar participants because they're aware that there is not necessarily the same resources in the women's game, although it's grown a lot. And so we really want to try and actually provide this better support all around our young girls and our female professional, semi-professional players. So thank you all for that. I know we are running out of time. We've had lots of questions, so I will try my best to kind of combine and bounce around some of them. Just to say, there's been quite a few questions on the submaximal fitness test we were just talking about. So just in brief for clarity, that is a submaximal test so that the athletes don't then have to exert themselves like they might do with a full-on fitness test. And as I mentioned before, Lil Shushan's work on this, maybe my video as well, talking about what the research is and where it's come from would definitely be worth a read, worth a watch to kind of become familiar with what the underpinning foundation of that is. So I may skip over some of those. One for Georgia here, and whether you can share this or not, or maybe whether this is how you would approach it or not. But a question of, on an average week, a 1 game week, what TRIMP specifically, so training impulse, which is the heart rate load, or other Firstbeat metrics are you looking at? And then how would that change if you're playing a 2 game week?
Yeah, so TRIMP is one of the metrics we look at, whether that's how we are prescribing a session and an aim for TRIMP that we're trying to get, also the TRIMP accumulation across the week. We also look at time above 90% and time above 80%, and those are our key metrics that we're looking at them at the moment, but we're still exploring others because Firstbeat do have a lot of metrics out there. This has varied a lot across pre-season, where we did have 1 match a week, and now in season, partly because we were really pushing in pre-season, so we were expecting a high TRIMP, and now that we're trying to deload, taper, reduce both the internal and the external load to freshen up our players for the game, we're expecting a bit of a lower TRIMP, and it is very variable between players as well, based on sort of their heart rate profile. Whether we've had some players at the beginning of the preseason coming back from injury, and then they're kind of just starting all their preseason almost now, because they're now being able to push, compared to others who did the whole preseason with us, and now they're a lot fitter. But we're seeing TRIMPs of anywhere from 300 up to about 700 in a 1 week match. Problem with the moment we're kind of looking at it is players don't always love to wear the heart rate straps during a match. So for some players, we don't have that heart rate data during a match. Others, they will wear it for the warm-up, they'll keep it on during the match. They're not starters and they come on as a sub. So we get an artificially inflated TRIMP, because TRIMP accumulates over time. And so if they're sitting and they're resting, they're still going to accumulate a TRIMP score, even though they're not exercising or playing the game. So at the moment, it's quite variable, and it's something that, as I said, we've just started using Firstbeat this year. So we're delving more into these numbers and seeing what is a normal match load for a player, so that hopefully they don't have to wear it every match throughout the season. As I said, it's very variable in terms of those TRIMP outcomes. Ideally, though, in terms of other outcomes for a 1 week match in training, excluding the match, we're hoping to get a minimum of 30 minutes above 9% of their heart rate. There's evidence to show that will maintain their cardiovascular fitness. So during the season, that's what we're aiming for. Pre-season, we were aiming for higher, and some players, depending on their heart rate profile, got that very quickly. Other players, because they were so fit, it took a lot longer for them to achieve those outcomes. And we also then bring that onto the rehab side of things. So we say, this is what our team is trying to get. Hopefully we can also get these outcomes with our players, and we're looking at those TRIMP accumulations over the week and the time above 80 and 90 for our rehab players as well as team.
Nice. Thank you, Georgia. Some really nice practical examples there again. And I like that combination where you have taken a value from the literature and gone, okay, we can translate that into our setting and use that as a guide, but also understanding our athletes again through that combination of internal and external load to understand when some are accumulating those minutes in high intensity red zone quickly, and others are lagging behind. But as we've spoken about, it may not necessarily be a reflection on them doing less work. Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, Dawn, someone has said that you mentioned that you shouldn't just determine the player's maximum heart rate from our standard 220 minus age. So in season, how would you determine what a player's max heart rate is, and how would you go about continuously updating that if you see it increase?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think obviously it depends what your pre-season profile is. I would typically do a maximal test in pre-season, whether that's a time trial, a 30-15, a yo-yo intermittent recovery test. Again, depends what you do. From that, you get an estimate of the player's peak heart rate in that assessment. Then I'd always continually just check any small-sided games, any match, basically across the week of training and match data. And if a player does update, again, there's some softwares I've used where that'll automatically update. I don't know if Firstbeat do, if it recognises that there has been a new max heart rate similar to max speed. So as soon as you then see it, I'd always check the profile to make sure it's not an error, it's not a spike. And then if a player has hit a new max heart rate, you'd then update it and make sure the thresholds are updated for that player. And then you just continuously kind of check that and yeah, just keep that profile updated.
Firstbeat
Fantastic. Go on, sorry, Georgia.
Firstbeat does have that feature, so it'll automatically tell you when there's a new heart rate, and you can choose whether to accept it after you've checked the trace or decline it.
Beautiful. Thank you. Okay, we had a couple of interesting questions actually around motivation. I'll share my thoughts, and then if anyone wants to jump in, feel free as well. So in terms of like combining the internal and external load, we had a couple of questions about how does this relate to behavioral drivers such as maybe work ethic, competitiveness, and someone also mentioned about using the daily Hooper index for a question around motivation. My take on this is that whilst the specifics around motivation are probably outside my remit, that's the kind of thing I would ask of the mental skills coach or the psychologist or someone like that if you have that kind of resource. But what I can do with this information is actually potentially highlight when there's an interesting trend. So again, to reiterate that our player tracking technology, if we have it, is that work completed, the distances, the speeds, and then the internal load, our heart rate is the cost. So if you yourself come back from holiday unfit, for example, your heart rate, your cost is going to be higher to do your Saturday park run or your average, standard park, your average run yourself. By monitoring that and looking into that and seeing when that is changing, I've done something in the past where I've used regression equations to predict the internal load based on athletes' external load. So based on the work they've done in training, what would we expect their TRIMP or their heart rate exertion to be? And then when that starts to deviate, it could be a flag that there is something more going on. It could be that they're getting fitter. It could be that they are fatigued. It could be that they are deconditioned. And I never know that solely looking at the numbers. But that's then when I go to others and I go to the experts and we potentially have a discussion as an MDT. And within that, perhaps the motivation maybe is a factor that the mental skills coach could bring up. So I think it's really interesting, and the fact that the first two questions actually that came in were both along those lines. There's great awareness that there are other factors going on, and whilst this information is really useful for us, let's just not get lost solely looking at the numbers, but remember the context that other specialists can help bring to this process. Anyone want to add anything onto that, or
I think Nicole said it right at the start. It's don't forget the human at the center of the data. And sometimes the data identifies outliers and it starts a conversation. So yeah, I think it's just don't forget the human. Many years ago, Tony Strudwick, who some might know, some might not, but he just basically said players are not spreadsheets, and so I think that probably typifies it of don't forget the human at the center of all of this data or data that you're collecting.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had one question about the accuracy of different heart rate monitoring devices. I know on Firstbeat's website, they've got a ton of research on there, sharing kind of their validity, reliability as a technology. And then I think as well, some of the practical points that the ladies have brought up on this call would be important to the day-to-day accuracy. So less about the actual measurement error within the technology, but actually making sure the athletes are wearing it appropriately, how they wear it. You know, often it doesn't work if they've got an undershirt on underneath, for example. I think those would be some of the key points. Anything there that I've missed?
Firstbeat have a feature which shows the measurement error as well. So you'll be able to look at the trace. It says you 10 centimeter measurement error. That's probably because it's dropped down low, or they've loosened it, or they've taken off for a second and they've put it back on. So that's another thing to make sure you're checking each time is the trace yourself, but then also Firstbeat has this cool little measurement error, so you can remove that data, or if you need to adjust that data based on the accuracy of it, that's helpful.
Brilliant. Really, another really useful feature there. So I know we're running out of time. I think maybe the last, and I have plenty of questions here. I'm afraid I haven't got to, but there's been a couple of questions about buy-in from athletes and coaches. I think we've already touched on it a little bit, but maybe in closing here, then I'd love to hear from each of you some actual practical tips for gaining buy-in from your coaches and athletes. Nicole, I'll come to you first.
I mean, yeah, Dawn has said it a number of times today, and that the education piece is huge. In my experiences, this is a generalization. I have found that female athletes, specifically female soccer players, they are hungry for information. And if you explain to them the why behind things, you'll get much more trust and buy-in from them. So one thing that I used to do is I would just go up to individual players and explain what and it's whatever it is, like whether it's wearing a heart rate monitor or doing a top-up session, like whatever you're asking them to do, having a one-on-one conversation and saying, hey, just so you know, this is what I'm looking at. This is what my concern is, or what I'm wanting to do here, and here's why. Here's how it benefits you. I'm looking out for your individual best interests here. And so in order to achieve that goal, and then typically I would try to give some options where it's appropriate. So in order to achieve that, we can try to get it in the session, and this is what we're looking for, or we can try something outside of the session. If it's something like wearing a heart rate monitor, I actually didn't really have a problem with this with our group. But being able, I think they just inherently, also Dawn trained all of them really well to know the importance of it, I think. But to be able to say, hey, I want to make sure that I know how you're responding to what we ask you to do. This tool helps me do that. Without that, I don't know that I can help you to the best of my abilities. And just make it about them, especially in a team sport. They want to know that you have their individual needs and goals in mind as best you can. So educate them on the why, have that one-on-one conversation. And I found that really helps with buy-in.
I think the same. Go on, Jojo.
But Nicole nailed it. The education piece and the conversations with the players is is gold, and female athletes generally want to know the why, which is absolutely reasonable. And there is generally reasons behind what we do. And so being able just to explain that to the players and them understanding it has helped with player buy-in.
Yeah, I think just to echo the same, like the education and the why. And I think because I've had conversations with female players about this, of why, as females, they do ask questions, and is some of it again the gendered society of boys come through academies or clubs or systems and they just get told what to do. Girls don't necessarily have that, so they're more inquisitive, they want to know why. And again, I just think that's learnings for practitioners who come into women's sport from men's sport, or male practitioners, to not get frustrated by that, or, well, this doesn't happen on the men's game, why is it happening here? Like, again, I think it's just understanding, appreciating, and then explaining the why. And yeah, I think you tend to get buy-in because, sometimes the sports science stuff, like, there's stuff players maybe like to do, but we also have to tell them to, or ask them to do things that they maybe don't necessarily like or enjoy doing. And so again, I think the more you can explain and educate, I think the greater the buy-in.
Just quickly, oh, sorry, Jo, just quickly on that,
Go on, Nicole, keep going.
I think that it's really important for anyone who comes into women's soccer to try as best you can to understand and learn about the history of women's soccer. And that helps with the context of why athletes that we're working with today are the way that they are and ask these questions. Like Dawn said, they haven't had the support that men's players have had most of the time. And often the support that they have had has been young practitioners who are at the start of their careers and maybe don't always know 100% what they're doing. And so a lot of these players do have trust issues, for lack of a better term. But if you understand where, specifically here in the US, like where the NWSL has come from, it was a league. This is the third or fourth iteration of a pro league here in the US. And the fear that athletes have of a league folding if they complain about something, like, it just really helps to connect with your athletes and get that trust and buy-in if you understand a little bit of the history of women's soccer in general.
A brilliant point to wrap everything up there, Nicole. Thank you very much. Yeah, really important point that as quickly as the game is expanding, we're still, seeking more resources to come into it. And as more resources come in, let's implement them well. Let's understand the science behind them. Let's start simple and then add on our layers so that this data that we're collecting is actually having an impact on your athletes. So hopefully in the past hour, we've provided some value, some knowledge on this topic. We want to thank Firstbeat, obviously, for putting on this webinar, bringing us all together. They want to share this bonus and more information with all the participants. And as we've said, acknowledge that they have stuff that is tailored for smaller budgets, because those working in the women's game might not have the same level of resources. So have a look at that and keep connected, because I think given the massive popularity of this webinar, we're going to be doing more stuff together, and there's going to be more content coming from Firstbeat on the topic specifically for our female athletes. So thank you very much, Nicole, Dawn, and Georgia. I think that was a fascinating panel, lots of value, lots of practical applications for people to take away. Unfortunately, we didn't get to all the questions, but hopefully it's triggered some curiosity as well in the attendees. So thank you, ladies, very much. And then thank you to Firstbeat Sports as well.
Thanks so much, Jo.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you, everybody.